London, 1845. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets like a shroud as Stephanie Wallis sat motionless at her bedroom window. Outside, London was beginning to stir, servants hurrying to markets, shopkeepers raising their shutters, carriages rattling along the damp streets. But Stephanie noticed none of it. Her attention was fixed entirely on the Morning Chronicle, trembling in her hands, her slim fingers crumpling the edge of the newspaper where the announcement was printed in neat black letters. The Earl of Huntley, George Bath, is pleased to announce his engagement to Lady Caroline Thornhill, daughter of the Viscount Heatherton. The wedding is to take place next month at St. George's Church, Hanover Square. A single tear escaped down her cheek, falling onto the paper and blurring the ink. Just 3 weeks ago, George had held her hands in the garden of her father's country estate, whispering promises of forever. His blue eyes had seemed so sincere, his voice unwavering as he spoke of their future together. "Father will come around, my darling," he had promised. "Once he sees how deeply I love you, he will accept you as my countess." Lies, all lies. She traced the announcement with a trembling finger. He hadn't even had the decency to tell her himself. No letter, no visit, just this cold, impersonal notice in the morning paper, as if their love had never existed at all. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Stephanie, dearest?" Her mother's voice was gentle. "Your father wishes to speak with you." Wiping away her tears, Stephanie smoothed her pale blue morning dress and took a deep breath to compose herself. Appearances mattered, even in heartbreak. She would not let George Bath's betrayal reduce her to a sobbing mess. "I'll be right down, Mother," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. In the mirror, she assessed her reflection. At 18, Stephanie Wallis was considered a beauty, with her honey-brown hair, vivid green eyes, and delicate features. The daughter of a prosperous textile merchant, she had been raised with all the accomplishments expected of a genteel young lady, despite lacking aristocratic blood. Perhaps that had been the problem all along. She was simply not good enough for the Earl of Huntley, regardless of what he had whispered in the moonlight. Straightening her shoulders, she descended the staircase to her father's study. William Wallis was a proud man who had built his textile business from nothing. Though not aristocratic, their family had earned respect among London's merchant class, and their home in Bloomsbury reflected their prosperity without ostentation. Her father stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his expression solemn. He did not turn when she entered, but spoke to her reflection in the glass. "I warned you, daughter," he said without preamble. "Men like the Earl of Huntley do not marry girls like us, not when their fathers control the purse strings." Stephanie flinched. Her father was not being cruel, merely stating a truth she should have recognized from the beginning. "I was foolish," she admitted, her voice surprisingly steady. "I believed him when he said love would conquer all." Her father finally turned, his eyes softening at the sight of his daughter's dignified bearing, despite her obvious pain. Though he had built his fortune through shrewd business sense, William Wallis had a gentle heart, especially where his only child was concerned. "It is not foolish to believe in love, my dear. Only to believe that love is enough for men whose character is wanting." He approached her, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Your Aunt Eleanor has written from London. She invites you to stay with her, to have a proper season next year." Stephanie looked up, surprised. Aunt Eleanor was her mother's sister, a widow who had married well and maintained her position in society after her husband's death. Though they visited occasionally, Eleanor moved in circles far above the Wallises' usual sphere. "You would send me away?" "Not away," her father corrected. "Forward. London is full of opportunities for a young woman of intelligence and beauty. Perhaps in time you will find a man whose worth is not measured by his title alone, but by the strength of his convictions." Stephanie glanced down at the newspaper still clutched in her hand. "I shall never trust my heart to another," she whispered. Her father's eyes grew sad. "Never is a very long time, my daughter." Anne Wallis joined them then, her kind face showing traces of the beauty Stephanie had inherited. She had been listening at the door and could no longer contain her concern. "William, are you certain this is wise? Sending her to London, to that world that just broke her heart?" "It wasn't London that broke her heart," he replied quietly. "It was one man's weakness. Would you have her hide away here, letting that weakness define her future?" Anne looked at her daughter, seeing both the girl she had raised and the woman emerging through adversity. "What do you wish, Stephanie? You need not decide immediately." Stephanie looked between her parents, these good people who had given her every advantage within their power. Perhaps her father was right. Perhaps the path forward lay not in retreat, but in facing the very society that would soon be gossiping about her heartbreak. "I will go," she decided. "After Christmas. I think I should like a quiet autumn at home before facing London again." Her father nodded approvingly. "A sound decision. It will give you time to prepare and Eleanor time to arrange introductions for the spring season." 2 days later, the Bath family's elegant carriage rattled past the Wallace home, carrying George and his parents to a dinner at the neighbouring estate. Stephanie watched from her window as George's profile appeared briefly behind the glass. For a moment, their eyes met, his widening with what might have been regret, before the carriage continued on its way. That night, as her maid packed her trunks for their return to London, Stephanie took out her diary and wrote by candlelight, "Today I bury my girlish dreams and foolish heart. Tomorrow I shall begin to forge myself anew. No man shall ever again have the power to break what I have mended." Little did she know how thoroughly that vow would be tested. The months passed slowly, in a haze of quiet routine. Stephanie declined invitations to local assemblies, knowing George and his fiancée might attend. Instead, she immersed herself in books, in improving her French and Italian, in helping her father with correspondence for his business. If her parents noticed how she startled whenever the mail arrived, how she scanned each delivery for a letter of explanation that never came, they did not mention it. Christmas came and went, a subdued affair compared to previous years. In January, as promised, Stephanie travelled to London with her mother, to take up residence with Aunt Eleanor, in her fashionable home in Grosvenor Square. Eleanor Harwick, née Wallace, had married a baronet who left her comfortably wealthy upon his death. Childless and with a vast social circle, she had been delighted at the prospect of launching her pretty niece into society. "My dear girl," Eleanor exclaimed, embracing Stephanie warmly when they arrived. "How lovely you've become. We shall have to order an entirely new wardrobe. Those country styles simply won't do for the season." Stephanie summoned a polite smile. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Aunt, but I'm not certain I wish to participate fully in the season. Perhaps a quieter introduction—" "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted. "The best way to mend a broken heart is to remind the world, and yourself, of your worth. By the time I'm finished, every eligible bachelor in London will be at your feet, and George Bath will be merely an unfortunate footnote in your story." Despite her reservations, Stephanie found herself swept into a whirlwind of fittings, social calls, and instruction on the latest London fashions and customs. Eleanor proved a demanding but effective mentor, refining her niece's already considerable accomplishments until Stephanie could hold her own in any drawing room in England. "Remember," Eleanor told her as they prepared for Stephanie's first small dinner party in February, "you are entering society not as a merchant's daughter seeking elevation, but as my niece and protégée. You have nothing to prove and no one to impress. That confidence, more than any title or fortune, will distinguish you." As winter gave way to spring, Stephanie gradually emerged from her shell of heartbreak. She would never be the carefree, trusting girl she had been before George's betrayal, but neither would she allow his weakness to define her existence. A new Stephanie was taking shape, more guarded, perhaps, but also more discerning, more self-possessed. When the season began in earnest, Eleanor carefully orchestrated Stephanie's introduction to society, selecting smaller gatherings at first before accepting invitations to larger balls. To her surprise, Stephanie found herself enjoying these events, particularly the conversations with interesting people from all walks of life. "You see," Eleanor remarked one evening as they returned from a musical soirée, "London offers so much more than heartbreak and disappointment." Stephanie smiled, genuinely this time. "You were right, Aunt. I'm grateful you insisted I come." What neither of them mentioned was the whispers that sometimes followed Stephanie through ballrooms, the pitying glances from those who knew of her history with the Earl of Huntly, the speculative looks from mothers with eligible sons. London society might be diverting, but it had a long memory for scandal, however minor. So far, she had managed to avoid encountering George and his new countess. The Earl and Countess of Huntly had removed to their country estate after their wedding, reportedly at the insistence of the old Earl, who was in failing health. Stephanie could only be grateful for their absence, even as she steeled herself for the inevitable meeting that must someday occur. That day came sooner than expected, at a ball hosted by the Duchess of Richmond in early May. Stephanie had just finished a dance with a pleasant young baronet when she felt it, a prickling awareness that made her turn toward the entrance. George Bath stood in the doorway, as handsome as ever in his formal attire, his golden hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Beside him was a woman Stephanie assumed must be Caroline, the new Countess of Huntly, tall, slender, with the regal bearing of one born to privilege. Stephanie froze, her practiced composure momentarily deserting her. Across the crowded ballroom, George's eyes found hers, widening in recognition and something that might have been longing. "Ah," Eleanor murmured, suddenly at her side. "I had heard they returned to town. Are you all right, my dear?" Stephanie forced herself to breathe normally. "Perfectly," she replied. "It was bound to happen eventually." "We can leave if you wish," Eleanor offered. "No." Stephanie squared her shoulders. "I will not be driven away. He has already taken enough from me." Throughout the evening, she was exquisitely aware of George's presence, though she carefully avoided any situation where they might be forced to interact. She danced every dance, laughed at every jest, and maintained such perfect composure that no one watching would have guessed the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. It was during a moment of respite, when she had stepped onto a secluded balcony for fresh air, that disaster struck. Stephanie. His voice, once so beloved, now sent a chill through her. She turned slowly to find George standing in the doorway, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "Lord Huntly," she acknowledged with a slight curtsy, proud of her steady voice. He winced at the formality. "Please, not that, not from you." "I'm not certain how else I should address my friend's husband," she replied evenly. George took a step toward her, then stopped as if uncertain of his welcome. "Caroline is not your friend." "No, she is not. A poor choice of words. The husband of a stranger, then. Is that what I am to you now? A stranger?" Stephanie looked at him directly, allowing herself to really see him for the first time since his betrayal. He was thinner than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes. "What would you have me say, George? That I think of you as the man who promised me the world, then announced his engagement to another woman in the newspaper, the man who lacked even the common courtesy to tell me to my face that his father's money meant more to him than my love?" He flinched as if struck. "It wasn't like that." "Then how was it?" she demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Explain it to me, for I have wondered these many months." George ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache despite everything. "Father gave me no choice," he said miserably. "He threatened to cut me off without a penny if I married you, to withdraw my commission in the Guards, to refuse me access to any of our properties. I would have been destitute with nothing to offer you but poverty and disgrace. And so instead you offered me betrayal," she replied quietly. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I should have come to you, explained the impossible position I was in. Instead, I took the easy path. I've regretted it every day since." Stephanie felt the last remnants of her girlish fantasies crumble away. The George she had loved was just that, a fantasy. This man before her, handsome and titled but morally weak, was reality. "How fortunate for you that your regret comes with a wealthy wife and your inheritance intact," she observed. George's face contorted with pain. "Do you think I'm happy? My marriage is a sham, a business arrangement. Caroline despises me and I—" "Please stop," Stephanie interrupted. "Your marital difficulties are not my concern. Whatever we once were to each other, we are nothing now." "Do you truly feel nothing?" he pressed, taking another step toward her. "Because I feel everything, Stephanie. I think of you constantly, dream of you." "Your Grace," a new voice interrupted from the doorway. "I believe your wife is looking for you." Stephanie turned to find a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the light from the ballroom. The newcomer stepped forward, and she recognized him with a start. Thomas Bradbury, Duke of Silvermere, one of the most powerful men in England. George stiffened, clearly displeased by the interruption but unwilling to challenge a duke. "Silvermere," he acknowledged with a stiff bow. "I was just catching up with an old acquaintance." "So I observed," the Duke replied, his deep voice cool. "However, Lady Huntly appears quite distressed by your absence." George hesitated, looking between Stephanie and the Duke. Finally, with a last anguished glance at her, he bowed again and departed. Silence fell on the balcony. Stephanie turned to thank her unexpected rescuer, only to find his piercing grey eyes studying her with unsettling intensity. "Thank you for your intervention, Your Grace," she said with a curtsy. "I fear the conversation was becoming difficult." "So it seemed," he agreed. The Duke was perhaps 30, with dark hair and the kind of commanding presence that needed no title to assert itself. "Forgive my intrusion, Miss Wallis," she supplied. "Stephanie Wallis." "Ah," he nodded slightly. "Lady Eleanor's niece. I've heard much about you." Stephanie raised an eyebrow. "From my aunt. I wasn't aware you were acquainted." "Eleanor Harwick has been a friend of my family for many years," he explained. "She speaks very highly of your intelligence and character." Before Stephanie could respond, Eleanor herself appeared in the doorway, her expression relieved when she spotted them. "There you are, Stephanie. I've been looking everywhere." She smiled warmly at the Duke. "Thomas, how kind of you to keep my niece company." "It was my pleasure," he replied, his eyes still on Stephanie. "Though I fear I interrupted what appeared to be an uncomfortable reunion." Eleanor's face darkened. "Bath cornered you. How dare he?" "It's done now," Stephanie said quickly, unwilling to make more of the incident than necessary. "His Grace was kind enough to provide an escape." "Then I am doubly in your debt, Thomas," Eleanor said. "First for attending my little dinner next week, and now for rescuing my niece." "I require no thanks for either," the Duke replied with unexpected warmth, "though I would consider it an honor if Miss Wallis would save me a dance at your gathering, assuming she will be present." Stephanie blinked, surprised by the request from a man who, by all accounts, rarely danced at social events. "Of course, Your Grace. I would be delighted." As they returned to the ballroom, Stephanie was acutely aware of the speculative glances that followed their little group. The Duke of Silvermere dancing with a merchant's daughter. It would set tongues wagging throughout London, but as she glanced back, she caught sight of George watching them, his expression a mixture of jealousy and despair. For the first time since reading that fateful announcement, Stephanie felt something other than pain when looking at him. She felt free. London, 1847. The ballroom of Harrington House glittered with hundreds of candles, their light reflected in gilded mirrors and the jewels of London's elite. Ladies in silk gowns of every hue swirled across the polished floor, while gentlemen in immaculate evening wear watched from the edges, calculating dowries and connections with the precision of military strategists. 2 years had passed since Stephanie Wallis had first entered London society with a broken heart and guarded hopes. At 20 years old, she had blossomed under her aunt's guidance. No longer the naive country girl, she had cultivated a reputation for wit and grace that made her welcome in drawing rooms across London. Her figure had matured into elegant curves, her honey-brown hair now styled in sophisticated coiffures that highlighted her delicate features. "Smile, my dear," whispered Aunt Eleanor, a handsome woman in her 40s whose sharp intelligence had allowed her to navigate widowhood with remarkable success. "Lord Winfield is watching you again," Stephanie obliged with a practiced curve of her lips that never quite reached her eyes. "Lord Winfield watches every unmarried woman under 30, Aunt. His interest is hardly flattering." "Perhaps not," Eleanor conceded, adjusting her lace shawl. "But you might consider that not every man has such hollow promises as your Count." "He was never my Count," Stephanie corrected automatically, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her emerald silk gown. "And I have no interest in becoming anyone's Countess," Eleanor sighed. 2 years is long enough to mourn what never was, Stephanie. Your heart cannot remain frozen forever." "Can it not?" Stephanie murmured, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman. "I find it serves me rather well. I can enjoy society without the inconvenience of attachment." "That is not living, child. That is merely existing." Stephanie was saved from replying by the sudden hush that fell over the ballroom. The majordomo's voice rang out, announcing the latest arrival with a gravity reserved for only the highest ranks. "His Grace, the Duke of Silvermere." Heads turned as Thomas Bradbury, the Duke of Silvermere, entered the room. At 30, he was at the height of his powers, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing grey eyes that surveyed the room with cool detachment. His face might have been carved from marble, all sharp planes and aristocratic angles, softened only by the sensual curve of his mouth. "The elusive Duke makes a rare appearance," murmured Eleanor, eyebrows raised. How fascinating. They say he hasn't attended a ball in months. He attended your dinner last spring, Stephanie reminded her. The memory of their brief encounter on the balcony 2 years ago had lingered. Though the dance he had requested never materialized, the Duke had been called away on urgent business before Eleanor's dinner party. True, but that was a small private affair. For Thomas to brave the Harrington ball with half of London in attendance suggests either extreme boredom or specific interest. Stephanie observed him dispassionately as he greeted their hosts. He looks thoroughly bored already. I imagine he'll depart before supper. Such cynicism in one so young, Eleanor chided gently. The Duke is different from most of his peers. They say he personally manages his estates and has doubled their productivity. A man of substance, not merely title. How admirable, Stephanie replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. The orchestra struck up a waltz and couples began to form on the dance floor. Stephanie accepted an invitation from a pleasant young barrister, allowing him to lead her into the dance with practiced ease. She moved through the steps automatically, her mind elsewhere, until a strange sensation, like a physical touch, made her glance toward the edge of the room. The Duke of Silvermere was watching her. Not with the casual assessment men usually directed at pretty young women, but with an intensity that made her miss a step. His grey eyes, cool and penetrating, seemed to look through her polite facade straight into the guarded chambers of her heart. Stephanie quickly averted her gaze, disturbed by her reaction. When the dance ended, she excused herself and sought refuge near one of the tall windows, fanning herself vigorously. "Miss Wallis." The deep voice startled her. She turned to find the Duke of Silvermere standing before her, impossibly tall and imposing at close range. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not simply grey, but flecked with silver, like storm clouds illuminated by lightning. "Your Grace," she curtsied, her training taking over. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," he confirmed, "which is why I've taken the liberty of requesting Lady Harrington to perform the service. She approaches now." Indeed, their hostess was hurrying toward them, looking delighted at the prospect of introducing the season's most eligible bachelor to one of its most admired young ladies. After the formalities were observed and Lady Harrington withdrew, the Duke spoke again. "You dance well, Miss Wallis." "Thank you, Your Grace, though I confess I was distracted and missed a step." "I noticed," he replied, a hint of amusement warming his stern features. "May I ask what captured your attention so completely?" Stephanie met his gaze directly. "I was wondering why the Duke of Silvermere, who reportedly finds society events tedious, would attend the Harringtons' ball only to spend his time observing a merchant's daughter." For a moment surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by something like approval. "Honesty," he said. "How refreshing. Most young ladies would have simpered and claimed to be overcome by the music. I've never seen the value in simpering, Your Grace." His lips curved slightly. "Nor have I. As for your question, I came because Lady Harrington is my godmother and insisted. I observed you because you were the only person in the room who looked as though they were secretly planning their escape." Stephanie couldn't help but smile. "Was I so obvious?" "Only to a fellow conspirator," he replied, offering his arm. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me to the terrace? The air in here has become stifling." Propriety demanded she refuse. Unchaperoned walks with gentlemen, especially powerful dukes, were fodder for gossip. Yet something in his direct gaze made her place her gloved hand on his sleeve. "Briefly, Your Grace, before my aunt sends out a search party." The terrace was mercifully empty, the night air cool against her flushed cheeks. London sprawled below them, a tapestry of lights and shadows under a sky strewn with stars. The sounds of the ballroom, the music, the laughter, the constant hum of conversation faded to a distant murmur. "You're not what I expected, Miss Wallis," the Duke said after a comfortable silence. "And what did you expect, Your Grace?" She leaned slightly against the stone balustrade, studying his profile. The usual ambitious debutante, eager to secure a titled husband. Stephanie laughed, the sound surprisingly genuine. "Then you must be relieved to find me neither ambitious nor hunting for a title." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "On the contrary, I find myself intrigued. Lady Eleanor speaks highly of your intelligence and character. She mentioned your father's business acumen as well." "You've discussed me with my aunt?" Stephanie asked, startled. "I make it a point to know about interesting people," he replied smoothly. "And you, Miss Wallace, are decidedly interesting." Before she could respond, the doors to the terrace opened, spilling light and music into the night. A familiar figure stepped out, then froze. George Bath, Earl of Huntly, stood before them, his handsome face slack with shock as he recognized Stephanie. In the 2 years since their confrontation, they had managed to avoid more than the most cursory interactions at social events. "Miss Wallace," he stammered, "I had no idea you would be here tonight." Stephanie felt the Duke's arm tense beneath her hand, though his face remained impassive. "Lord Huntly," she acknowledged with a slight nod, proud of her steady voice despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "How is Lady Caroline?" George flinched visibly. "Well, she is, well." His eyes darted between her and the Duke. "Silvermere," he added with a stiff bow. "Bath," the Duke replied, his tone glacial. "I believe Miss Wallace and I were just returning inside." Without waiting for a response, he guided Stephanie back toward the ballroom. As they reached the doors, he leaned down slightly. "There is history between you," he stated rather than asked. "Ancient history," Stephanie replied, "and not worth revisiting." Something flickered in his grey eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred wounded spirit. "Miss Wallace," he said formally as they rejoined the crowd, "may I call upon you tomorrow? There is a matter I would like to discuss with you and Lady Eleanor." Stephanie hesitated only briefly before nodding. "My aunt receives visitors after 11, Your Grace." As he bowed over her hand, his lips barely brushing her glove, Stephanie felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Not the giddy infatuation she had once felt for George, but something steadier, more substantial. It terrified her. Later that night, as her lady's maid helped her prepare for bed, Stephanie found herself unable to dismiss the Duke from her thoughts. Unlike most men of his rank, he had asked no probing questions about her family's fortune or connections. Instead, he had conversed with her as an equal, displaying genuine interest in her opinions on everything from Italian poetry to the agricultural improvements being implemented on his estates. "A penny for your thoughts, miss," her maid said as she brushed out Stephanie's long hair. "You've been smiling to yourself this past quarter hour." Stephanie caught herself, schooling her features to neutrality. "Have I? I was merely reflecting on this evening's entertainment. If you don't mind my saying so, miss, you seem to enjoy yourself more than usual, especially in the company of that tall gentleman." "That tall gentleman was the Duke of Silvermere, Lucy," Stephanie corrected gently. "And a lady never discusses her admirers with her maid." Lucy smiled knowingly. "Of course, miss, though if he calls tomorrow, as you expect, shall I press your blue morning dress? It brings out your eyes something wonderful." Stephanie couldn't help but laugh. "Yes? Very well. The blue dress it is." After dismissing her maid, Stephanie stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the sleeping city. For 2 years, she had guarded her heart behind walls of ice, determined never again to be vulnerable to the kind of pain George Bath had inflicted. She had received and refused 4 proposals of marriage in that time, each from respectable gentlemen who offered security and position. What then was it about Thomas Bradbury that made her walls seem suddenly less impregnable? "It is mere curiosity," she told herself firmly. "Nothing more." Yet as she finally drifted to sleep, it was the Duke's storm-grey eyes and unexpected smile that followed her into her dreams. The Duke of Silvermere was a man of his word. At precisely 11 o'clock the next morning, his magnificent carriage arrived at Eleanor's townhouse on Grosvenor Square. From her position near the drawing-room window, Stephanie watched him descend. Tall and commanding even in morning dress, his movements possessing the natural grace of a man completely at ease with his power. "Stop staring, dear," Eleanor chided, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "One might think you were actually interested in our visitor." Stephanie stepped quickly away from the window. "I was merely ensuring it was indeed his grace and not some other caller. With that carriage, those matched greys are unmistakable, as is the Silvermere crest." Eleanor adjusted a vase of flowers with practiced precision. "Now, remember what I told you. The Duke is not like other men. He values directness and abhors the usual social games." "I am perfectly capable of carrying on a conversation without resorting to games, Aunt," Stephanie replied, smoothing her blue dress, which, she had to admit, did complement her complexion admirably. When the butler announced the Duke, both women rose to greet him. Stephanie was struck again by his commanding presence. how the spacious drawing-room seemed suddenly smaller with him in it. Lady Eleanor, Miss Wallis. He bowed to each of them in turn, his eyes lingering a moment longer on Stephanie. Thank you for receiving me at such short notice. Eleanor gestured to a chair. Do sit down, Thomas. Such formality among friends is unnecessary. His eyebrows rose slightly at the word friends, but he took the offered seat. Stephanie noted that unlike many aristocrats who lounged in chairs as if they owned them, the Duke sat with the alertness of a man accustomed to attending to business rather than pleasure. I've come to invite you both to Silvermere Court, he announced without preamble. I'm hosting a small house party next week. 2 weeks in the countryside would be a pleasant change from London's heat. Eleanor looked delighted. How thoughtful. But surely your invitation list was completed ages ago. We wouldn't wish to inconvenience you. No inconvenience, he assured her, his eyes finding Stephanie's. In fact, the party was conceived only last night, with Miss Wallis specifically in mind. Stephanie nearly choked on her tea. I beg your pardon? You mentioned once enjoying horsemanship, he continued smoothly. Silvermere boasts some of the finest riding country in England. I thought you might appreciate the opportunity. When did I mention horsemanship? She asked, genuinely confused. A hint of a smile played at his lips. At the Winthrop Musicale, 3 weeks ago, you spoke of missing your father's stables. The fact that he had remembered such a casual comment, made during a brief conversation weeks before, was both flattering and unsettling. Your Grace, she began carefully, while I appreciate the invitation, we would be delighted, interrupted Eleanor firmly. Wouldn't we, Stephanie? Caught between her aunt's expectant look and the Duke's steady gaze, Stephanie acquiesced. Of course. Thank you for thinking of us, Your Grace. Thomas, he corrected. If we're to be house guests, I insist you use my given name. That would hardly be proper, she protested. I'm a duke, he replied with a hint of arrogance that should have been off-putting but somehow wasn't. I decide what's proper. After finalizing the details with Eleanor, he rose to leave, but paused before Stephanie. Would you care to accompany me to the British Museum this afternoon? He asked. They've acquired some fascinating artifacts from Egypt I thought might interest you. Stephanie blinked, surprised again by his attention to detail. She had mentioned her interest in antiquities only in passing to a mutual acquaintance at a dinner party months ago. That's very thoughtful, but I couldn't possibly— We would be delighted, Eleanor interrupted again, ignoring Stephanie's pointed look. Shall we say 2 o'clock? After he departed, Stephanie rounded on her aunt. What are you doing? You're practically throwing me at the man. Eleanor's eyes softened. My dear girl, do you not see? He's absolutely smitten with you. Nonsense, Stephanie scoffed, though a treacherous warmth spread through her at the suggestion. Men like Thomas Bradbury don't become smitten. They calculate advantageous matches. And what advantage would the Duke of Silvermere gain by marrying the daughter of a textile merchant? Eleanor challenged gently. He has wealth and power beyond measure. He needs no connections your father could provide. Stephanie had no answer for that. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of attention from the Duke. True to his word, he escorted her to the British Museum, where he had arranged a private viewing of artifacts not yet available to the public. Rather than the expected formal tour, he had engaged the museum's foremost Egyptologist to explain the historical context of each piece, allowing Stephanie to examine them up close in a way normally reserved for scholars. The morning after, a small package arrived containing an exquisite miniature scarab carved from lapis lazuli with a simple note, a token of rebirth, T. Every day brought new surprises, rare books on subjects she had mentioned enjoying, invitations to exclusive exhibitions and small dinner parties where the conversation was genuinely stimulating rather than the usual vapid gossip. Each gift showed thought rather than mere extravagance. Each outing revealed another layer of his complex character. He courts you as if he were a poet rather than a duke, Eleanor observed one evening as they prepared for yet another dinner, at which the Duke of Silvermere would be present. Most men of his rank would simply speak to your father and have done with it. We are merely friends, Stephanie insisted, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. He enjoys my conversation, nothing more. Eleanor gave her a knowing look. My dear, the man has attended more social events in the past month than in the previous year, solely to be in your company. That is not the behavior of a man seeking friendship. At Silvermere Court, a magnificent estate in Kent, Stephanie discovered a different side of the Duke. Here, among his tenants and servants, he was respected rather than feared. He knew every worker by name, inquired after their families, and took genuine interest in their well-being. The house party itself was small and carefully selected, just 12 guests, including Eleanor and Stephanie. The Duchess Dowager, Thomas's mother, acted as hostess, a formidable woman whose initial coolness toward Stephanie gradually thawed as she observed the young woman's intelligence and lack of artifice. "For you handle my son well," the older woman remarked one afternoon as they took tea in the morning room. "Few people dare to challenge him as you do." Stephanie set down her cup, surprised by the comment. "I wasn't aware that I challenged him, Your Grace." "No? Just yesterday you quite thoroughly dismantled his argument about the Corn Laws. I haven't seen him so animated in a debate for years." "I hope I didn't overstep," Stephanie said, suddenly concerned. The Duchess Dowager laughed, a surprisingly warm sound from such an austere woman. "My dear, Thomas has been surrounded by sycophants since he was in short pants. A little honest disagreement is precisely what he needs." She studied Stephanie with shrewd eyes. "You're not what I expected, Miss Wallis." "So your son has said as well," Stephanie replied, "though neither of you has explained what exactly you did expect." "The usual sort of young woman who catches a duke's eye, beautiful but vapid, concerned only with fashion and status." The Duchess sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Instead, he brings home a merchant's daughter who reads Greek and discusses agricultural reforms with more intelligence than most members of Parliament." Stephanie wasn't sure if this was a compliment or criticism. "My father believes education is valuable regardless of one's station or gender." "A progressive view," the Duchess noted, "and one I happen to share, though it's unfashionable to admit it." She set down her cup decisively. "You should know that I have never interfered in Thomas's personal decisions, even when I disagreed with them. I will not start now, but I will say this. If my son has chosen you, then he has chosen wisely." On their daily rides across the rolling countryside, Thomas revealed more of himself: his childhood, his strict father, his dreams for improving his estates and the lives of those dependent on him. Stephanie found herself sharing her own hopes and fears in return, dropping the guarded persona she had cultivated since George's betrayal. "My title gives me responsibility, not just privilege," he told her, as they rested their horses atop a hill overlooking the vast Silvermere lands. "Each of these families depends on my good stewardship." "You care for them," Stephanie observed, watching as he gazed across his domain with genuine concern rather than proprietary pride. "I do my duty," he corrected, though his expression softened. "Just as I will do my duty to provide an heir." Stephanie's heart inexplicably clenched at the mention of his future marriage and children. She turned away, pretending to adjust her riding habit. "Your future Duchess will be fortunate indeed to share such a legacy." Thomas dismounted and approached her horse, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've been looking for her for a long time," he said quietly. "Someone with intelligence, compassion, and strength. Someone who sees beyond the title to the man beneath." Before she could respond, hoofbeats approached, and a stable boy appeared with an urgent message. The moment passed, but Stephanie found herself thinking of his words late into the night. It was during the final week of their stay that disaster struck. A grand ball had been planned to close the house party, with neighbors from across the county invited. Hours before the guests were to arrive, a messenger came galloping up the drive with news that sent the household into chaos. Lord and Lady Huntley were among the expected guests, and they had already departed for Silvermere. "I had no idea they were invited," Stephanie gasped when Eleanor delivered the news. "I cannot face him, not here, not now." "Thomas would never have invited them knowingly," Eleanor assured her. "Lord Huntley's cousin is married to the local magistrate. They must have been included on his list." Stephanie paced her chamber, panic rising. "I should plead illness." A knock interrupted her, and Thomas himself entered after Eleanor's acknowledgement. In his riding clothes, with his dark hair tousled by the wind, he looked less like a duke and more like a medieval warrior. Dangerous and thrillingly unpredictable. "I've just been informed of the guest list oversight," he said without preamble, his expression grave. "Stephanie, I would never deliberately cause you distress. Say the word and I'll have it announced that the ball is postponed due to an urgent matter requiring my attention in London." Stephanie stared at him, stunned by the offer. "You would disappoint over 100 guests to spare my feelings. I would do far more than that," he replied simply. In that moment, something within her shifted. This man, who commanded one of the oldest dukedoms in England, who could silence a room with his presence alone, was offering to upend his carefully planned event, risking gossip and inconvenience, solely for her comfort. "No," she decided, straightening her shoulders. "We will not postpone. I have nothing to be ashamed of, and I will not hide." Thomas smiled, a real smile that transformed his austere features. "You continue to surprise me, Stephanie Wallace." That evening, she wore her finest gown, a creation of deep blue silk that made her eyes appear even greener. As she descended the grand staircase to join the receiving line beside Thomas and Eleanor, whispers rippled through the assembled guests. The Duke of Silvermere had placed Miss Wallace in the position typically reserved for the lady of the house. When the Earl and Countess of Huntly were announced, Stephanie felt Thomas's hand at the small of her back, a subtle, steadying presence. George's eyes widened when he saw her standing beside the Duke, while Caroline's lips thinned with displeasure. "Lord Huntly, Lady Huntly," Thomas greeted them coolly. "May I present Miss Stephanie Wallace, my special guest?" George's bow was stiff. "We are acquainted." "Indeed," Thomas replied, his tone deceptively light. "How fortunate, then, that you'll have much to discuss. Though I fear Miss Wallace's dance card is quite full this evening." Throughout the evening, Stephanie was aware of George watching her, his eyes following her movements with naked longing as she danced with Thomas, laughed with his friends, and charmed the local gentry. Caroline, too, observed her with increasing resentment, particularly when the Duchess Dowager engaged Stephanie in a lengthy conversation, treating her with a deference rarely shown to those outside the aristocracy. Later, as Thomas led her through a waltz, Stephanie caught glimpses of George watching them, his expression a mix of regret and something darker. "He's staring," she murmured. "Let him," Thomas replied. "Let him see what he was fool enough to discard." The evening progressed smoothly until supper, when Stephanie found herself momentarily alone in the gallery, having stepped away to admire a particularly fine landscape. The sound of footsteps made her turn, expecting Thomas, but instead, George Bath stood before her. "Stephanie," he began, his voice low and urgent. "Please, allow me a moment." She raised her chin. "Lord Huntly, I don't believe we have anything to discuss." "I was wrong," he blurted. "So terribly wrong. Not a day passes that I don't regret my choice." "Your choice?" she repeated. "You mean choosing wealth over love, or merely announcing your engagement in the newspaper without the courtesy of telling me first?" He flinched. "I was a coward. Father threatened to cut me off without a penny." "And now you have both title and fortune," she interrupted, "while Lady Caroline has a husband who pines for another woman. How fortunate you both are." George stepped closer, his familiar scent bringing unwelcome memories. "My marriage is empty, Stephanie. Caroline and I are strangers who share a name and nothing more. She has her diversions. I have my regrets." "Neither of which concern me," Stephanie replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Don't tell me you feel nothing," he pressed. "I see how you avoid looking at me, how you tense when I enter a room. Those are not the reactions of indifference." "You mistake aversion for passion, my lord." "Do I?" He reached for her hand. "Or does the great Duke know he's receiving damaged goods, a heart that still belongs to another?" Stephanie jerked away as if burned. "How dare you? Is there a problem?" Thomas's voice, cold as steel, cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, his powerful frame blocking the exit, his expression murderous. George paled, but stood his ground. "A private conversation, Silvermere, nothing more." "There is nothing private between you and Miss Wallace," Thomas replied, advancing into the room with the controlled menace of a predator. "Nor will there ever be again." "You presume much," George retorted, though he retreated a step. "Stephanie and I share a history you know nothing about. A history you discarded for 30 pieces of silver," Thomas countered. "Now, you will either return to the ballroom and your neglected wife, or you will leave my home entirely. The choice is yours." For a moment, it seemed George might refuse, but self-preservation won out. With a stiff bow to Stephanie, he departed. Thomas waited until his footsteps faded before turning to her, his expression softening instantly. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. surprised to find it true. Seeing George again, hearing his self-serving regrets, had affected her far less than she had feared. "I'm sorry you had to intervene." "I'm not," Thomas said firmly. "I've wanted to put Bath in his place since the moment I learned what he did to you." Stephanie looked up, startled. "You know?" "Eleanor told me everything," he admitted. "I wanted to understand why someone with your warmth and intelligence guards her heart so fiercely. And now you do," she said quietly. "Now you understand why I cannot, why I will not risk such pain again." Thomas took her hands in his touch gentle despite the strength evident in his frame. "Stephanie Wallace," he said softly, "if you believe Thomas Bradbury resembles George Bath in any way, then I have failed completely in showing you who I am." "It's not about who you are," she whispered. "It's about who I am, a merchant's daughter beneath your station, someone society will never accept as your equal." "Society?" Thomas scoffed. "What has society ever created or built? What valleys has it made fertile? What innovations has it sparked? Men like your father who build and create, they are worth 10 of the idle aristocrats who fill my ballroom." He lifted her chin with gentle fingers. "I am the Duke of Silvermere. I bow to no one's expectations save my own, and I have never, in 30 years, wanted anything or anyone as much as I want you." Stephanie's heart thundered in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," he replied simply. "I love your mind, your spirit, your compassion. I love how you challenge me, how you see the man behind the title. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to spend my life proving that not all men are fools like George Bath." Tears pricked at Stephanie's eyes. "Thomas, you don't need to answer now," he said gently. "Take all the time you need. I've waited 30 years to find you. I can wait a little longer for your heart to heal." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, chaste, reverent, then offered his arm. "Shall we return to our guests? I believe this dance is mine." As they re-entered the ballroom, whispers spread like wildfire at the sight of the Duke of Silvermere, gazing at Stephanie Wallace, as if she were the only woman in the world. News of the Duke of Silvermere's apparent infatuation with Miss Stephanie Wallace spread through London society like wildfire. By the time they returned to the city, speculation was rampant about whether the realm's most eligible bachelor had finally been captured. The ton divided neatly into factions, those who found the romance charming, primarily the younger set and progressives, and those who considered it a shocking misalliance, led by mothers with eligible daughters and staunch traditionalists. Stephanie found herself the object of intense scrutiny wherever she went, with invitations flooding in from hostesses eager to witness the courtship firsthand. "You've become quite the sensation," Eleanor observed as they sorted through the day's post, which contained no fewer than 12 invitations. "I haven't seen such excitement since the Prince Regent took up with Mrs. Fitzherbert." Stephanie wrinkled her nose. Hardly a comparison to inspire confidence. Their relationship was a scandal, and ended in marriage, despite the odds, Eleanor pointed out. "Though I dare say Thomas is far more decisive than poor Prinny ever was." George Bath was not the only one disturbed by these developments. Caroline, Countess of Huntly, had harboured ambitions of eventually securing a connection to the Silvermere dukedom through her younger sister. The prospect of a merchant's daughter, particularly one her husband had once courted, gaining the position she coveted for her family was intolerable. "The girl is making a spectacle of herself," Caroline declared to her circle of friends over tea. "Throwing herself at a duke, as if Silvermere would ever seriously consider someone of her background." Stephanie, entering Hyde Park for an afternoon stroll with Eleanor, overheard these words as she passed Caroline's group. She faltered momentarily, colour rising in her cheeks. Eleanor squeezed her arm supportively. "Pay them no mind, dear. Jealousy makes women cruel." "It isn't jealousy that concerns me," Stephanie replied quietly. "It's truth. Thomas may believe himself immune to society's expectations, but a duke marrying a merchant's daughter would cause a scandal." "Thomas Bradbury has never feared scandal," Eleanor pointed out, "and your father is hardly a common shopkeeper. His business employs hundreds. His advice is sought by ministers. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "love has a way of overcoming such obstacles." Stephanie was prevented from responding by the arrival of the very man they discussed. Thomas approached on horseback, magnificent atop his black stallion, drawing admiring glances from everyone in the vicinity. He dismounted gracefully and handed the reins to his groom, before bowing to the ladies. "Lady Eleanor, Miss Wallis," he greeted them, eyes lingering on Stephanie. "What a pleasant surprise." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Is it? I rather thought you knew our walking schedule by heart, Your Grace." Thomas didn't deny it. "Beautiful weather for a stroll, is it not? Would you mind terribly if I accompanied you?" "Actually, I've just remembered an urgent appointment," Eleanor said, fooling no one. "Perhaps you could escort Stephanie back to Grosvenor Square when she's finished her walk, Thomas?" Before Stephanie could protest this transparent maneuver, Eleanor was hurrying away, leaving them alone, though under the watchful eyes of the ton. "Your aunt is not subtle," Thomas observed, offering his arm. Stephanie took it, acutely aware of Caroline Bath's narrowed gaze from across the path. "No, she is not, and she has placed us both in an awkward position." They began walking along the path, trailed at a discreet distance by Thomas's groom and Stephanie's maid. "I don't find your company awkward in the slightest," Thomas replied. "In fact, these past 3 days without seeing you have been interminable." "You exaggerate," she chided gently. "Surely the affairs of your vast estates kept you occupied." "They kept my hands occupied," he corrected. "My mind was entirely elsewhere." Stephanie felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, even as she tried to maintain her composure. "Thomas, we're being watched. Lady Huntley and her friends are positively gloating at this indiscretion." Thomas glanced over his shoulder at the group of women, his expression hardening. "Caroline Bath's opinion means less than nothing to me." "But it should matter to you what society whispers," Stephanie insisted. "A duke must consider his position, his legacy." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Do you know what legacy truly matters to me, Stephanie? Not ancient titles or crumbling castles. It's the character of the man who bears the name Bradbury. My father taught me that a duke who bows to society's petty constraints is no leader at all." His grey eyes held hers with fierce intensity. "I have watched you these past weeks. I've seen your kindness to my servants, your genuine interest in my tenants' welfare. I've witnessed your sharp mind and sharper wit. Everything I've learned has only confirmed what I knew the moment I saw you. You are the woman I want by my side, the only woman worthy of being my Duchess." Stephanie's heart pounded painfully. "Thomas, please." "I know you're afraid," he said softly. "Bath hurt you deeply. But I am not him, Stephanie. I would never choose anything, money, title, approval over you." A commotion behind them interrupted the moment. George Bath was approaching rapidly, his face flushed with what appeared to be drink, though the hour was early. Caroline rose from her bench, alarm evident in her expression. "Bradbury," George called, loud enough to draw the attention of every passer-by. "A word, if you please." Thomas stepped slightly in front of Stephanie, his posture protective. "Lord Huntley." "I suggest you lower your voice. You're making a scene." George laughed bitterly. "A scene? Rich coming from you. The entire ton speaks of nothing but your infatuation with my—" He caught himself, but not before Stephanie's face paled. "Your what, exactly?" Thomas's voice was dangerously soft. "Choose your next words with extreme care, Bath." Caroline hurried to her husband's side, grasping his arm. "George, you're unwell. We should return home." He shook her off. "Not before His Grace understands what he's involving himself in." George turned to Stephanie, his eyes pleading. "Tell him, Steph. Tell him how we planned our future together before my father's interference." Stephanie lifted her chin. "That was a lifetime ago, Lord Huntley. I was a different person then, naive enough to believe promises whispered by moonlight." "I never stopped loving you," George insisted, his voice breaking. "Even now, seeing you with him, it's torture." Caroline inhaled sharply, her face contorted with humiliation. Thomas stepped forward, his control visibly slipping. "You dishonor your wife and yourself, Bath. Leave now, while you still can." "Or what?" George challenged, emboldened by drink and desperation. "Will the great Duke call me out? Over a merchant's daughter?" The words had barely left his lips when Thomas's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling onto the path. Gasps erupted from the gathering crowd. "Thomas!" Stephanie cried, horrified. He stood over George, breathing hard. "Get up, Bath, get up so I can knock you down again." Caroline rushed to her fallen husband, throwing a venomous glance at Stephanie. "This is your doing," she hissed. "You've destroyed my marriage for your ambitions." "Enough!" Thomas's command silenced everyone. He turned to his groom. "Jenkins, please escort Lord and Lady Huntley to their carriage." He offered his arm to Stephanie. "Miss Wallace, allow me to take you home." The ride to Grosvenor Square passed in tense silence. When they arrived, Thomas helped Stephanie down from his carriage, his touch gentle, despite the anger still evident in his bearing. "I apologize for my loss of control," he said stiffly. "It was unworthy of me." "You struck an Earl in Hyde Park," Stephanie replied, her voice trembling. "Over me. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I don't give a damn what they say," Thomas replied, his composure finally breaking. "Let them talk. Let them whisper behind their fans and speculate in their drawing rooms. None of it matters." "It matters to me," Stephanie cried. "Can't you see? This is exactly what I feared. Becoming the center of scandal, dragging your name into disrepute." Thomas took her hands in his. "Stephanie, listen to me. Society's memory is short, and its opinions fickle. Next week, some other scandal will replace ours. What endures is what we build together." "And what is that exactly?" she asked, tears threatening. "A life," he answered simply. "A partnership of equals, regardless of birth. I'm asking you to be my wife, Stephanie. My Duchess, the mother of my children, the keeper of my heart." Stephanie stared at him, overwhelmed. "You're proposing? Now? After what just happened? Now? Tomorrow? Every day for the rest of our lives, if necessary?" He dropped to one knee there on her aunt's doorstep, heedless of the servants and passers-by watching in astonishment. "Stephanie Wallace, I love you with every fiber of my being. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my Duchess?" Before she could answer, the door flew open to reveal Eleanor, wide-eyed with excitement. "For goodness sake," she exclaimed, "bring His Grace inside before you accept, Stephanie. The entire street is watching." Thomas rose, a smile finally breaking through his serious demeanor. "Well, may I come in to hear your answer?" Looking at his dear, familiar face, so full of love and certainty, Stephanie felt the last of her defenses crumble. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes to coming inside, and yes to becoming your wife." The joy that transformed Thomas's face was worth every whisper, every scandal that might follow. The news of their engagement spread even faster than the rumors of their courtship had. Within hours, it seemed all of London knew that the Duke of Silvermere intended to wed Miss Stephanie Wallace, daughter of the textile merchant. Reactions were predictably mixed. "You'll need a special license," Eleanor said practically, once the initial excitement had subsided. "And we must inform your parents immediately, Stephanie." "I've already written to them," Thomas said, surprising both women. "The letter should reach them by tomorrow morning. I've invited them to Silvermere Court for the wedding." Stephanie raised her eyebrows. "That's rather presumptuous, don't you think? I might have refused you." Thomas's eyes warmed with affection. "I hoped rather than presumed. But you're right, I should have waited. Would you prefer to be married in London? Or at your parents' home?" The ease with which he deferred to her preferences, despite having already made arrangements, touched Stephanie deeply. This was a man accustomed to command, yet willing to yield for her comfort. "Silvermere is perfect," she assured him, "though I fear 2 weeks is hardly enough time to prepare for a duchess's wedding." "We can wait if you wish," Thomas offered. "Though I confess the thought of a lengthy engagement holds little appeal," Eleanor laughed. 2 weeks is quite sufficient. The wedding need not be large, family and close friends only. The real challenge will be preparing Stephanie for her role as Duchess." Thomas shook his head. "Stephanie needs no preparation. She already possesses every quality essential for the position." "Sweet of you to say," Eleanor replied, "but there are practical matters to consider. The responsibilities of managing multiple estates, the social obligations, the protocols of rank, all of which can be learned," Thomas interrupted gently. "What cannot be taught is character, and Stephanie has that in abundance." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Letters arrived from Stephanie's parents expressing their delight and promising to arrive at Silvermere the following week. The Duchess Dowager sent a gracious note welcoming Stephanie to the family. Thomas appeared each day with a new token of his affection. Not flashy jewels, as might be expected, but thoughtful gifts that revealed how well he knew her heart. Not everyone was pleased by their impending union. Caroline Bath made her displeasure known through thinly veiled barbs at social gatherings. Several of Thomas's relatives expressed concern about the match, though none dared oppose him directly. And George, in his cups at his club, was overheard making bitter remarks about merchants' daughters with ducal aspirations. "Ignore them," Thomas advised when Stephanie mentioned these reactions. They matter not at all. They were dining at Eleanor's house, chaperoned but afforded some privacy by her discreet withdrawal to the far end of the room. They're your family and peers, Stephanie pointed out. Of course they matter. Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. The only opinion that matters to me is yours. Do you love me, Stephanie? You know I do, she replied softly. Then the rest is noise. His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. Though I do wonder sometimes if you love me for myself or for my title. Stephanie snatched her hand away, stung. That's not amusing. Forgive me, he said, contrite. A poor attempt at humor. I know your heart is sincere, just as mine is devoted entirely to you. As the wedding approached, Stephanie found herself increasingly anxious, not about marrying Thomas, but about the responsibilities that awaited her as Duchess of Silvermere. One afternoon, while reviewing guest lists with Eleanor, she finally voiced her fears. What if I'm not equal to it? What if I embarrass him or fail at some crucial duty? Eleanor set down her pen. My dear, do you think Thomas hasn't considered this? He's the most meticulous man I know. If he didn't believe you capable, he wouldn't have asked you. But managing an estate like Silvermere is a skill like any other, Eleanor finished for her, and one you'll master quickly, knowing your intelligence. Besides, duchesses aren't made overnight. You'll have time to grow into the role. And if the ton never accepts me, if they always see me as an upstart, a merchant's daughter who reached above her station. Eleanor's expression softened. Some will, it's true. There will always be those who resent you, for your beauty, for capturing Thomas, for ascending to a position they believe should have gone to one of their daughters. But the only opinion that truly matters is Thomas's. Do you love him enough to weather those storms together? Stephanie considered the question seriously. I do, she said finally. I love him enough to face anything, even the scorn of society. Then you'll make a splendid duchess, Eleanor declared. Now about these invitations. 3 days before they were to depart for Silvermere, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. Stephanie was reading in Eleanor's drawing room when the butler announced Lady Caroline Bath. Show her in, Stephanie said, setting aside her book and rising to greet her unexpected visitor. Caroline swept into the room, impeccably dressed as always, her beautiful face set in haughty lines. Miss Wallace, she acknowledged with the barest nod. Lady Huntley, Stephanie returned coolly. This is an unexpected pleasure. Let us dispense with pleasantries, Caroline replied. I've come on a matter of some delicacy. Stephanie gestured to a chair. Please, be seated. Caroline remained standing. I prefer to stand. What I have to say won't take long. She drew a deep breath. You must break your engagement to the Duke of Silvermere. Stephanie blinked, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon? Break your engagement, Caroline repeated. End this farce before it goes any further. And why would I do that? Stephanie asked, amazed at the woman's audacity. Caroline's perfect composure slipped slightly. Because George is destroying himself over you. Because our marriage is in shambles. Because he drinks himself into oblivion every night, murmuring your name in his sleep. Stephanie stared at her, genuinely shocked. Lady Huntley, I am truly sorry for your marital difficulties, but they have nothing to do with me. They have everything to do with you. Caroline's voice rose. He never loved me. He married me for my fortune while pining for you, and now you flaunt your happiness with the Duke before him, driving him further into despair. That's not true, Stephanie protested. I've avoided Lord Huntley at every turn. If he suffers, it's from the consequences of his own choices. Caroline laughed bitterly. How convenient to absolve yourself. Tell me, do you love the Duke, truly love him? Or is he merely your revenge on George, the ultimate prize to throw in his face? How dare you, Stephanie said quietly, anger rising. My feelings for Thomas are none of your concern, and if you think for one moment that I would break his heart to ease your husband's conscience, you're sorely mistaken. Caroline's face hardened. Then you leave me no choice. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small packet of letters. Do you recognize these? With a sinking feeling, Stephanie did. They were the letters she had written to George during their courtship, foolish, passionate declarations of love from a naive girl of 18. Where did you get those? She whispered. George kept them, Caroline replied, a cruel smile playing at her lips. Hidden in his desk. I found them months ago." She fanned the letters like cards. "Such ardent sentiments, Miss Wallis. What would the Duke think if he read them? If all of London read them?" Stephanie felt the blood drain from her face. "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't I? You've taken everything from me. My husband's heart, my dignity, my future. Why should I spare yours?" For a long moment they faced each other in silence, two women in love with different men, bound by circumstance and mutual enmity. "What do you want?" Stephanie finally asked. "I told you, end your engagement. Leave London, return to whatever provincial backwater spawned you, and never darken our lives again." Stephanie's mind raced. The letters, while embarrassing, contained nothing truly scandalous, just the innocent outpourings of first love. Yet in the hands of someone like Caroline, they could be wielded as weapons, used to hurt Thomas or to cast doubt on Stephanie's character. "You have until tomorrow," Caroline continued, replacing the letters in her reticule. "If I don't hear of your broken engagement by then, copies of these will be in every drawing room in Mayfair." With that, she swept from the room, leaving Stephanie trembling with shock and rage. Eleanor found her there an hour later, still staring into space. "My dear, what's happened? You're white as a sheet." Haltingly, Stephanie related Caroline's visit and her threat. "That spiteful harpy," Eleanor exclaimed. "How dare she? You must tell Thomas immediately." "I can't," Stephanie said miserably. "He'd challenge George to a duel. There would be bloodshed, scandal. Exactly what I've feared all along." "So you'll give in to blackmail?" Eleanor demanded. "Surrender your happiness because of a vindictive woman's threats?" "Of course not," Stephanie replied, her voice stronger. "But I need to handle this carefully. Those letters need to be recovered." "And how do you propose to do that? Break into Bath House and steal them?" Stephanie's expression turned thoughtful. "Not quite so dramatic, but I do have an idea." Later that evening, as Thomas sat with her in Eleanor's drawing room, properly chaperoned by a dozing aunt, Stephanie broached the subject indirectly. "Have you ever done something you regretted?" she asked. "Something that came back to haunt you years later?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Many things. I think all thinking people have regrets. But have your regrets ever threatened your present happiness?" He studied her face, sensing the weight behind her question. "Stephanie, what's troubling you?" She took a deep breath. "Caroline Bath visited me today." Thomas's expression darkened. "What did she want?" "To deliver a threat," Stephanie admitted. "She has letters I wrote to George years ago. Girlish, romantic nonsense. She's threatening to make them public if I don't break our engagement." She watched his face carefully, expecting anger, perhaps even doubt. Instead, his expression softened with understanding. "My poor love," he said gently. "What a dreadful position to be put in." Relief flooded through her. "You're not angry?" "At you? For writing love letters before you ever met me?" "Of course not." His eyes hardened. "At Caroline Bath, most definitely. The woman needs to be taught a lesson in civility." "Please," Stephanie begged, "don't confront her. It will only make things worse." "I have no intention of confronting her," Thomas replied with dangerous calm, "but neither will I allow her to threaten my future wife with impunity." He rose, pacing the room with controlled energy. "These letters, they contain nothing truly compromising, I assume. Nothing worse than romantic declarations and poetry," Stephanie confirmed. "But they're private. The thought of them being read by strangers—" "They won't be," Thomas assured her. "I'll see to it personally." "Thomas, whatever you're planning, trust me," he interrupted gently. "By this time tomorrow, the letters will be in your possession, and Lady Huntley will be thoroughly chastened. Now tell me more about these wedding preparations. I believe you were considering blue roses for your bouquet." The abrupt change of subject startled her, but Stephanie recognized Thomas's tone. The matter was settled in his mind. Further discussion would be fruitless. The next morning, a package arrived for Stephanie. Inside were her letters to George, along with a note in Thomas's bold hand. "My dearest Stephanie, these now belong to you, as does my heart. Burn them or keep them as you wish. Lady Huntley will trouble you no more. All my love, T." Stephanie stared at the package in amazement. How did he manage this? Eleanor, reading over her shoulder, chuckled. "I suspect our Thomas can be quite persuasive when necessary. The real question is, what did he say to Caroline Bath to make her surrender her only leverage?" They didn't have long to wonder. That afternoon, word spread through London society that Lord and Lady Huntley had departed abruptly for their estate in Cornwall, with no explanation given for their sudden removal from town. When Thomas called that evening, Stephanie immediately demanded answers. What did you do? Half of London is speculating about the Bath's mysterious departure. Thomas looked entirely too pleased with himself. I merely had a conversation with Bath at his club. About what exactly? About certain investments his father-in-law made on my recommendation. About the mortgage on their London house, which is held by a bank in which I have a controlling interest. About how unfortunate it would be if Lady Huntley's vindictive behavior were to have financial consequences. Stephanie's eyes widened. You threatened their livelihood? I outlined potential outcomes, Thomas corrected. Bath is not a complete fool. He understood that his wife's actions could cost them dearly. I imagine he persuaded her to return your letters and remove to the country until the scandal blows over. Thomas, Stephanie said slowly, that's rather ruthless. He took her hands in his. When it comes to protecting you, I make no apologies for ruthlessness. Caroline Bath attempted to destroy your happiness out of spite and jealousy. She deserved far worse than a temporary exile to Cornwall. Stephanie should have been appalled at this display of ducal power. Instead, she felt strangely protected, not because Thomas had wealth and influence, but because he had wielded them so decisively in her defense. Thank you, she said softly, though I hope you won't make a habit of threatening financial ruin to anyone who crosses me. Thomas smiled, his stern features softening. Only in the most extreme circumstances, I promise. He kissed her hands. Now, shall we discuss happier matters? Your father's letter arrived today. They'll be at Silvermere by Tuesday. With the threat from Caroline neutralized and the Baths safely distant, the final preparations for the wedding proceeded smoothly. Stephanie's parents arrived at Silvermere Court with appropriate wonder at the magnificence of the estate, but even greater pride in their daughter's composure. You look like you belong here, her father observed, as they walked through the grand picture gallery. Not intimidated in the least. I've had time to adjust, Stephanie replied, and Thomas has been remarkably patient in introducing me to my future home. William Wallace studied his daughter's face. You love him, he said simply. Not his title or his wealth, but the man himself. I do, Stephanie confirmed, more than I thought possible after what happened before. Good, her father nodded approvingly. That's all I need to know. The Duchess Dowager, initially reserved with the Wallaces, gradually warmed to their unpretentious intelligence and obvious devotion to their daughter. By the eve of the wedding, she was engaged in animated conversation with Anne Wallace about the best methods for preserving fruit, all difference in rank apparently forgotten. You see, Thomas murmured to Stephanie as they observed their families mingling comfortably. This is what matters, not the gossip of strangers, but the bonds between those we love. Stephanie leaned against him slightly, savoring these last moments before she became his wife. I was so afraid they wouldn't belong here. They belong because you belong, he replied simply, and you belong because I can't imagine Silvermere without you. 3 weeks later, as autumn painted the countryside in golds and crimsons, the Duke of Silvermere married Miss Stephanie Wallace in a private ceremony at Silvermere Court. Only family and closest friends were invited, though William Wallace insisted on paying for a lavish wedding breakfast, despite Thomas's protestations that it was unnecessary. My daughter is marrying a duke, the proud merchant declared. Allow me this one indulgence. The couple exchanged vows beneath the ancient oak that had witnessed 20 generations of Bradburys, Thomas's voice steady and sure as he promised to cherish Stephanie for all his days. She, in turn, pledged her heart to him without reservation. The ice that had encased it for so long finally and completely thawed. Among the small gathering, George and Caroline Bath were conspicuously absent. Rumors had circulated that they had departed for their country estate, their marriage in tatters following the Hyde Park incident. As Thomas kissed his bride to seal their vows, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes, while William Wallace stood tall, his initial reservations about aristocracy thoroughly revised by the character of his new son-in-law. Later, as they danced their first waltz as husband and wife, Thomas held Stephanie close. "Happy, Your Grace," he murmured in her ear, using her new title for the first time. "Deliriously," she confirmed, savoring the words. though I believe I've married a scandalously unconventional duke. And I've married a scandalously perfect duchess, he countered. One who will help me make Silvermere better than it's ever been. A commotion at the entrance to the ballroom drew their attention. To Stephanie's shock, George Bath stood in the doorway, alone and ashen-faced. The music faltered as guests turned to stare. Thomas tensed, his arm tightening protectively around Stephanie's waist. George approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance before bowing deeply. "Your Graces," he addressed them formally. "Forgive my intrusion. I could not stay away without offering my sincere congratulations and my apologies." He looked directly at Stephanie, his expression haunted yet somehow peaceful. "I came to say that you were right to refuse my belated regrets. I made my choice years ago and I must live with it. Seeing you now, so radiant, so loved, I understand that everything unfolded as it should." Turning to Thomas, he continued, "You are a better man than I, Silvermere. I ask only that you cherish her as she deserves." "On that, Bath, you need have no concern," Thomas replied, his tone civil though guarded. George nodded once. "I wish you both every happiness, truly." With another bow, he turned and departed as suddenly as he had arrived. Stephanie watched him go, feeling not pain or regret, but an unexpected sense of closure. "Well," Thomas said quietly, "that was unexpected." "Yes," she agreed, "but necessary, I think, for all of us." As the music resumed and they continued their dance, Stephanie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The heartbreak that had once seemed unbearable had led her here, to a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. Thomas's grey eyes held hers, full of promises yet to be fulfilled. "What are you thinking, my Duchess?" Stephanie smiled up at the man who had chosen her above all else, above convention, above expectation, above the weight of centuries of tradition. "I'm thinking," she replied, "that sometimes hearts must break before they can be truly whole again." Thomas drew her closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "And yours? Is it whole now?" "More than whole," she whispered. "It's yours, completely and forever." The early days of the Duchess of Silvermere's marriage were not without challenges. Though Thomas's immediate family had accepted Stephanie without reservation, certain relatives and peers made their disapproval known through subtle snubs and pointed remarks. At her first dinner as hostess at Silvermere House in London, Lady Rockingham, a distant cousin of Thomas's, deliberately addressed her as Miss Wallace throughout the evening. When corrected, she affected surprise. "Oh dear, how forgetful of me. It's just so difficult to remember all these recent changes." Thomas, overhearing, had intervened with lethal politeness. "Perhaps at your age, Cousin Agatha, memory becomes unreliable. Should you find such lapses occurring frequently, I recommend consulting Sir William Harvey. I understand he's made remarkable progress in treating the infirmities of advancing years." Lady Rockingham, not yet 60 and vain about her appearance, had turned an unflattering shade of purple. "You shouldn't antagonize her," Stephanie murmured when they were alone. "She has considerable influence in certain circles." "Let her use it then," Thomas replied dismissively. "Those who cannot accept my Duchess are not welcome in my home, regardless of their bloodlines." True to his word, Thomas backed Stephanie unequivocally in every social encounter. When the Duchess of Montrose failed to include Stephanie in an invitation to a musical evening, Thomas not only declined, but returned all subsequent invitations from the Montroses unopened. When Lord Essex made a thinly veiled reference to tradesmen's daughters at a dinner, Thomas challenged him to clarify his meaning with such cold fury that the older man stammered an apology and departed early. "You cannot fight every battle for me," Stephanie told him after that incident. "Some of this I must weather on my own." "Must you?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "Why?" "Because I need to establish myself as the Duchess of Silvermere, not merely as your protected wife," she explained. "Those who respect only your power will never truly accept me." Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. But know that while I may not intervene, I am always watching, and I never forget a slight to those I love." Stephanie soon discovered that she had natural allies beyond her husband. The younger members of society, less bound by traditional prejudices, found her refreshing. Several influential dowagers, bored with the usual social climbers, declared her a breath of fresh air. And Thomas's mother, the Duchess Dowager, proved an unexpected champion. At a particularly grand ball hosted by the Countess of Harewood, an old friend of the Duchess Dowager's, Stephanie overheard a group of matrons discussing her in barely hushed tones. "Merchant's daughter or not, she has Thomas Bradbury wrapped around her finger," one commented. "I've never seen him so besotted." "It won't last," another predicted. "These misalliances never do. Once the novelty wears off, he'll regret marrying beneath him." "I wonder if she trapped him somehow," a third speculated. "There was that scandalous business in Hyde Park with the Earl of Huntly." "Ladies," the Duchess Dowager's voice cut through their gossip like a blade, "I find it curious that you speak with such authority on matters you know nothing about." The women turned, mortified to find Thomas's mother standing behind them. "Your Grace," the first woman stammered. "We were just demonstrating precisely why new blood is so desperately needed in our circles," the Duchess Dowager interrupted. "My daughter-in-law may come from trade, but she possesses something far more valuable than ancient lineage: character. Perhaps if your daughters had shown similar qualities, one of them might have captured my son's interest." With that devastating observation, she swept away, leaving the matrons speechless. When she related the incident to Stephanie later, the younger woman was touched almost to tears. "You needn't have defended me," she said. "I'm growing accustomed to such talk." "Nonsense," the Duchess Dowager replied briskly. "One should never grow accustomed to ill-breeding. Besides," she added with a rare smile, "I've waited 30 years to see my son genuinely happy. I'll not have small-minded gossips undermine that happiness." Gradually, through a combination of Thomas's unwavering support, her own natural dignity and strategic alliances, Stephanie established herself as a duchess to be reckoned with. She applied her intelligence to mastering the complexities of managing multiple estates, her father's business acumen proving invaluable in understanding the financial aspects of Thomas's vast holdings. Under her guidance, Silvermere Court's neglected gardens were rejuvenated. She established a school for the tenants' children, insisting on modern educational methods rather than the rote learning common in such institutions. She reviewed the estate accounts personally, identifying inefficiencies and implementing improvements that increased both productivity and the well-being of those who worked the land. In London, she carefully selected charitable endeavours that aligned with her values rather than merely following society's fashionable causes. Her patronage of a hospital for women and children in the East End raised eyebrows initially, but her practical approach to improving conditions there soon earned respect even from her critics. "You're making quite a reputation for yourself," Thomas observed proudly after one particularly successful fundraising event. "Lady Jersey actually asked for your opinion on her new charitable foundation. I believe that constitutes acceptance at the highest level." Stephanie laughed. "Lady Jersey recognizes a useful ally when she sees one, but yes, I do feel less like an interloper these days." "You never were an interloper," Thomas corrected gently. "You were always exactly where you belonged, by my side." Their personal happiness deepened as they settled into married life. Unlike many aristocratic couples who maintained separate lives after securing an heir, Thomas and Stephanie genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They shared intellectual interests, a commitment to improving their estates, and a passion for each other that showed no signs of dimming with familiarity. "We scandalized the servants," Stephanie teased one morning, as Thomas pulled her back to bed, despite the late hour. "A duke and duchess who actually love each other, how unconventional." "Let them be scandalized," Thomas murmured against her neck. "I've never aspired to conventionality." Not everyone celebrated their happiness, however. In Cornwall, George Bath brooded over reports of the Duchess of Silvermere's growing acceptance in society. Though he had made his peace with Stephanie's marriage, watching from afar as she thrived in her new life was a constant reminder of what his weakness had cost him. His relationship with Caroline remained strained, their brief reconciliation after the confrontation with Thomas having proved short-lived. They maintained appearances in public, but lived essentially separate lives, united only by mutual resentment and social obligation. When they finally returned to London after a year's absence, George was determined to avoid any further scenes. He had written to Thomas formally, acknowledging past errors and requesting a clean slate between their families. Thomas had responded with cool civility, neither encouraging nor forbidding renewed social contact. Their first encounter in society, at a large reception hosted by the Duke of Wellington, passed without incident. George and Caroline greeted Thomas and Stephanie with correct politeness, exchanged the minimum required pleasantries, and moved on. "That wasn't so terrible," Stephanie remarked afterward. "No," Thomas agreed. "Bath seems to have learned discretion, if nothing else." But Caroline, watching her husband's gaze follow Stephanie across crowded ballrooms, nursing her humiliation at being exiled to Cornwall, was not so easily reconciled. The wound to her pride festered, fueled by George's obvious continuing preoccupation with his former love. "You make yourself ridiculous," she hissed one night as they returned from a ball where Stephanie had been particularly radiant. "Mooning after her like a lovesick boy when she clearly doesn't spare you a thought." George, tired and slightly drunk, rounded on her. "And whose fault is that? If you hadn't threatened her with those letters—" "Don't you dare blame me for your failures," Caroline snapped. "You lost her long before I entered the picture. You chose money over love, George. At least have the courage to own your decision." The argument escalated, voices rising until servants could hear them through closed doors. In a final fury, Caroline declared, "I curse the day I married you." "Not half as much as I do," George retorted viciously. The next morning, Caroline was gone. A brief note informed George that she had returned to her parents' home and would not be coming back. She requested that he not attempt to contact her. Alone in his London house, George faced the ruins of his life with grim clarity. He had sacrificed true love for wealth and position, only to lose both his fortune, much diminished by poor investments and excessive spending, and his self-respect. Now his wife had abandoned him, his reputation was tarnished, and the woman he had truly loved was happier than he had ever seen her, with another man. In that dark moment, something broke within him. Not his heart, that had shattered years before, but rather the shell of pride and self-deception that had sustained him through the consequences of his choices. For 3 days, he remained secluded, refusing all callers and barely eating. On the 4th day, he sat down at his desk and wrote 2 letters. The first to Caroline acknowledged his failings as a husband and released her from any obligation to return to a marriage that had brought her only unhappiness. The second, to his solicitor, contained instructions for settling his affairs in preparation for an extended absence. That evening, he appeared unannounced at Silvermere House. The butler, recognizing the Earl of Huntly, despite his dishevelled appearance, hesitated before announcing him. "His Grace and Her Grace are not receiving visitors tonight, my lord. Perhaps if you were to return tomorrow—" "Please," George said simply. "It's important." Something in his tone, desperation tinged with resignation, convinced the servant to admit him to a small waiting room while he informed the Duke of this unexpected caller. Thomas appeared moments later, his expression wary. "Bath," he acknowledged. "This is unexpected." George rose unsteadily. "Forgive the intrusion, Silvermere. I wouldn't have come if it weren't a matter of some urgency." Thomas studied him with narrowed eyes. "You look unwell." "I am unwell," George admitted with a bitter laugh. "In spirit, if not in body. May I speak with you, and with Her Grace, if she's willing?" Thomas hesitated, clearly reluctant to subject Stephanie to whatever scene might be brewing. "What is this regarding?" "Closure," George replied simply, "and perhaps redemption, though I've little right to hope for it." After a long moment, Thomas nodded. "Wait here." He returned with Stephanie, who had changed from her evening dress into a simpler gown of deep green. Her face, when she saw George, showed concern rather than the resentment he expected. "Lord Huntly," she greeted him. "Are you unwell? Shall I send for a physician?" Her kindness, after everything, was almost his undoing. George struggled to maintain his composure. "No, thank you. I'm not ill, merely at a crossroads." He drew a deep breath. "I've come to say goodbye. I'm leaving England." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Leaving? For where?" "America. My cousin has business interests in Boston that require management. I've agreed to represent him there." George turned to Stephanie. "Before I go, I needed to speak with you both, to make things right as much as possible." Stephanie glanced at Thomas, who nodded slightly. "Please sit down," she offered. "Would you care for refreshment?" George shook his head. "No, I won't stay long." Nevertheless, he sank gratefully into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he truly was. "Caroline has left me," he said bluntly. "Not that you'd be interested in my marital difficulties, but it seems relevant to what I have to say." "I'm sorry to hear that," Stephanie said, and meant it. George smiled faintly. Are you? You of all people have reason to wish us ill. I've never wished you ill, George, she replied gently. Only happiness, even when you hurt me. He closed his eyes briefly, pained by her generosity. That's the difference between us, I suppose. Your capacity for forgiveness. It's why you deserved better than me. He looked directly at Thomas. And why you found it. Thomas said nothing, but his expression softened fractionally. I came to apologize, George continued. Properly, not the half-drunken ravings at your wedding. To both of you, for different reasons. He turned to Stephanie. To you, for my cowardice. For choosing money over love. For not telling you to your face for every hurt I inflicted through weakness of character. You offered me your heart, and I crushed it for the sake of my inheritance. There is no forgiveness adequate for such a betrayal, but I ask for it nonetheless. Then to Thomas. And to you for my behavior since your engagement, for creating scenes, for speaking disrespectfully of your wife, for being less than a gentleman in every way. You were right to defend her as you did. I would have done the same had I possessed your courage. The room fell silent. George waited, expecting recrimination, or at best cold acceptance of his apology. He was unprepared for Stephanie's next words. I forgive you, George, she said softly. I forgave you long ago, though I didn't realize it until this moment. Thomas looked at his wife with tender pride before turning back to George. As does the Duke of Silvermere forgive the Earl of Huntly, he said formally. The past is behind us. May you find peace in your new endeavors. George stared at them both, overwhelmed by a generosity of spirit he had not anticipated and knew he did not deserve. Thank you, he managed finally. Your forgiveness means more than you can know. He rose to leave, then hesitated. May I ask one thing more? A presumption, I know, but... Ask, Thomas said simply. In America, I intend to start anew, to build something useful with my life rather than wasting it as I have done. When I return, if I return, might I hope to find not friendship perhaps, but at least the possibility of civil acquaintance between us. Thomas glanced at Stephanie, who nodded almost imperceptibly. You will always be welcome at Silvermere, Thomas said gravely. Not for the man you were, but for the man you are striving to become. George bowed deeply. I am in your debt. Both of you. He turned to go, then paused at the door. Be happy together, he said softly, as I believe you already are. After he had gone, Stephanie leaned against Thomas's shoulder. Do you think he'll find peace? Thomas wrapped an arm around her waist. Perhaps. He seems genuinely remorseful. And America is a land of second chances, they say. I'm glad we could offer forgiveness, she mused. It feels like the closing of a chapter. Indeed. Thomas kissed the top of her head. Though I confess I'm far more interested in the chapters we've yet to write together. Stephanie smiled up at him. As am I, Your Grace. As am I. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Silvermere became one of the most admired couples in England. Their partnership, initially viewed as scandalous, gradually came to be seen as a model of modern marriage, based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection rather than mere dynastic considerations. Thomas's estates flourished under their joint management. The school Stephanie established for tenants' children became a template copied by progressive landowners across the country. Their London home was known for salons that brought together not just aristocrats but also artists, scientists, and innovators of every background. When their first child was born, a son they named William after Stephanie's father, the celebration at Silvermere Court included not only the highest nobility, but also workers from Thomas's estates and employees of William Wallace's textile business. It was, as one observer noted, a gathering that would have been unimaginable a generation ago, peers and commoners united in celebration of a child who represents the best of both worlds. As for George Bath, he remained in America for 5 years. When he finally returned to England, it was as a changed man, leaner, more weathered, but with a clarity of purpose that had been lacking in his youth. He had built a successful shipping business in Boston and reconciled with Caroline, who had eventually joined him there after their initial separation. True to his word, Thomas received them at Silvermere when they came to pay their respects. The meeting between the two couples was initially awkward, but gradually eased into something approaching comfortable acquaintance. Not friendship, Too much had passed between them for that, but a civil relationship built on mutual respect and shared history. "He seems genuinely happy," Stephanie observed after the Baths had departed. "As does Caroline, surprisingly." "America agreed with them, it seems," Thomas replied. "Perhaps they needed to escape the constraints of English society to find their way back to each other. Much as we defied those same constraints to find our way to each other," Stephanie pointed out with a smile. Thomas pulled her close, his grey eyes warm with the love that had only deepened over the years. "The best decisions often require courage, my Duchess. Fortunately, you've never lacked for that." Stephanie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Nor have you, my Duke. Nor have you." In the end, the story of the merchant's daughter who became a duchess was not merely a romantic tale of crossed social boundaries. It was a testament to the power of true character over artificial distinctions, of genuine love over societal expectations. The Duke of Silvermere had indeed chosen Stephanie over everything, over tradition, over convenience, over the prejudices of his class. And in doing so, he had gained not just a wife but a partner, not just a duchess but a soulmate. And Stephanie, who had once vowed never again to trust her heart to any man, had found in Thomas Bradbury the courage to love completely and without reservation. The walls she had built around her heart after George's betrayal had not merely been breached, they had been transformed into the foundations of something far stronger, a love that would endure long after both of them were gone, remembered in family stories, in the improvements they had made to their lands and the lives of those who depended on them, and in the changing attitudes of a society gradually learning that true nobility lay in character rather than bloodline. As Thomas had promised on that long-ago day in Hyde Park, their love had indeed outlasted scandal, outlived gossip, and outshone every difficulty placed in its path. The Count had broken her heart for money, the Duke had chosen her over everything, and in the end both had found exactly what they deserved. The end. Dear listener, when darkness settles and the house grows quiet, stories like Thomas and Stephanie's remind us of a simple truth. No clock determines when our best moments arrive. You've lived enough to know false promises. You've seen enough to spot authentic gold among life's trinkets. That wisdom? It's your crown. Tonight, rest knowing this. Sometimes what seems like the end is merely clearing space for what you actually deserve. Stephanie's heart didn't just heal. It found something better than what it originally sought. Your setbacks aren't final chapters. They're plot twists. Your age isn't a limitation. It's accumulated power. Your heart isn't fragile. It's battle-tested. Tomorrow, carry one thought. In a world racing forward, you possess something rare. Perspective. Use it boldly. Someone needs your earned wisdom. Someone needs your unfiltered truth. Someone needs the courage you demonstrate simply by continuing your story. Sleep well. Dream deeply. Rise knowing you're not just surviving time, you're collecting its treasures. With genuine admiration,